Now, international scientists are meeting near Tokyo for a week-long summit to talk about how we are all screwed. Topic of this meeting will be the recent climate change report released from the IPCC that once again warns of floods, droughts, wars, and other horrible, terrible things in the future from unmitigated climate change. These scientists and government reps will be meeting in Yokohama to exchange ideas, figure out how to shape policies that will get their government on board to fight climate change. Another report from this meeting will be released about the end of March. Related news, the Pentagon has once again affirmed climate change to be a serious threat to national security in its quadrennial defense review. In this review, it states that climate change not only will cause logistical problems, but also points out the impact of climate change on resource competition. Now, we've seen a lot of meetings and reports. Do you guys think that it will ever turn into action? And what would it take, in your opinion, for something to actually come from these meetings? Because right now, it's been nothing.
Well, for me, like, these meetings, they're just going to perpetuate. It's basically just all the scientists getting into a room and saying, look, this thing's happening. Why isn't anyone paying attention? I think I saw an infographic the other day where it had the number of, out of all the scientific papers in 2012, only 2 out of the 500 or so said it's not man-made. So only 2 out of, God knows how many hundreds. But really, all these scientists are getting in a room, and they're saying, you need to deal with it. They're saying if you don't deal with the CO2 levels within the next couple of decades, then you just can't reverse the effects. Then we're going to go into a real negative spiral, which you won't be able to get out of. And it's just the case that the media, it's not an interesting story for them, which is why it's not getting presented in any long-term way. The media's not covering it, and the politicians, because it's a long-term story, because it's over decades rather than the next year or the next election cycle, they're not too worried about it either. And so that's why these conferences still should happen. I'm not against the conferences in and of themselves, but they're not going to achieve anything by having these conferences, because the conferences can't do anything themselves. It's the other institutions, the media, the politicians actually have to get something done, and they're not that bothered about the long term for their own personal reasons.
I mean, to kind of parrot Steven's point a little bit, it's not that interesting of a story because they release one of these reports every whatever amount of years, or probably every year, or probably every week, and nobody does anything about it. But to like certain points that were specifically mentioned, the Pentagon saying it's a national security issue. Pentagon says everything's a national security issue. This is actually kind of like pretty true, but they just want more funding, so I don't really care what the Pentagon says. But yeah, like nothing's gonna get done off of this report. Like they can meet and do whatever. It's not gonna change anything.
Yeah, I want to actually reference an argument that TYT co-host Wes Clark Jr. made on the air one day, and I think Stephen will maybe have something to contribute here. Climate change is a national security threat because part of what climate change does is that it can change like ocean jet current, the prevailing currents and stuff like that affect a lot of weather. And countries like England that are pretty high, north in terms of latitude, have fairly temperate weather because of these warm ocean currents. If you take away those warm ocean currents, you look at other countries at that same latitude and the weather that they have, and it's not really conducive to large populations like England has. And for right or wrong, who's our boy in every fight? Like it's Stephen, man. Those guys are always backing us up, regardless of whether or not we need to be in the fight in the first place. For the last 50 years, they have been in our corner. And if something that could, be catastrophic to Britain happens, that's catastrophic to America's security.
Well, I mean, we're not, a lot of British people, they're not too upset about global warming. They want it to maybe go on a tiny bit because it's freezing and raining over here pretty much every single day of the week. But you're right, kind of any change in the climate, it's going to affect the Gulf Stream, and that's going to really mess up. I mean, we've had, well, I say America's had it as well. You've had really bad climate over the last couple of years. Recently, we've had kind of a huge waves of flooding, and But I mean, going back to your point, kind of saying that America should help out, its allies, and their kind of global warming is going to hit its closest ally or supposed closest ally, but the problem is because the countries just really care about themselves. They're not too worried about even their closest allies. They just think about how is it going to affect me. And America, okay, you get the extreme global events every now and again, but because they haven't had anything huge happen to them, they just go, oh, we can still deal with it. We'll deal with these little kind of cuts that essentially, with America not dealing with it, and I don't want to single America out, but with America not dealing with it, they're just slowly giving themselves little cuts, kind of on the wrist and stuff, with all these kind of natural kind of extreme events happening, and then one day there's going to be a huge event, and it's essentially going to be like America cutting its own throat, and they go, oh, it's too late now, we can't deal with this massive gouge that we've caused ourselves. But yeah, I mean, it would be nice if America would help out England, but I don't think any of us are holding out hope.
Well, I mean, for selfish reasons we should. Like, you guys are basically the only reason that Europe ever gets on board with anything we do. You are the liaison between Europe and America, and we need you in that capacity for better or worse.
I think there's a couple of things to just broaden this out. Yes, America does hold a huge place in the world's politics and geopolitics, but I think these conferences are important to have because there are other places in the world. The other places in the world do listen to science, and I think that the more you hear from these things, even though if they're every week and the media doesn't play it, your media doesn't play it. Other places in the world play it. It gets more attention in different places in the world, and that's important. Also, the way we're going to solve the environment a lot of times is going to be local. So you don't necessarily need the federal government all the time to be doing things. The local governments can take initiative and push their state governments or provincial governments or wherever you're at. That'll help too. I think the big problem you're obviously having in a lot of countries like Canada and America, Australia, etc., is the problem of the old barons of industry, which is the energy industry, which is oil and natural gas now even, but especially crude oil and tar sands here in Canada. There's a huge lobby, obviously, for nothing to change. So, yes, there's going to be problems with industry, but I think at the end of the day, science just needs to keep getting louder. I don't think just because people are apathetic means that they should stop talking. And the problem with the media story that you guys covered, the problem with making these stories sexy is what we saw in the last decade, where you did try to have some, real talk about this is going to rapidly change the situation for many countries that will be underwater, and like what happens to New York and the famous scene from An Inconvenient Truth, and all that ends up in is because the population is not well educated. You hear things like, "Man, it's I wish we had more global warming. It's -10 here in Toronto," and you slap your head and go, "That's not what climate change means." Yeah. So it's kind of on us at the end of the day, but I think for the greater global community, we need it. You need more of these, a lot less of them.
Right.
I think
I want to kind of hit on what you mentioned, Sean, and as well as what you guys talked about in the media. Now, this report is actually the 5th report on climate change. Now, this is the 5th one to say that human activities are causing climate change, right? More than it would naturally. And, what you also said about the media not making it sexy, I do agree. Because how can you really make it sexy when you're saying, look, if we don't do something, this and this and this and this is going to happen, and it's all going to be not good.
The
right?
only way that CNN would have covered this report is if somebody came up with the conspiracy theory that global warming caused the MH370 plane to fall out of the sky. That is the only way the mainstream media would have covered this report.
Right, and that's the point. We turn on network news, and all you can see is that they're still having a conversation on whether or not the science is sound, right? You got climate denier on, and then you've got, not even a scientist most of the time. You've got some random pundit or whatever, or somebody talking about, the danger of climate change. Science really isn't represented in these discussions. And then, what conclusions are people supposed to be able to draw from those so-called debates when the debate is over?
Can I ask, Stephen? Can I ask you a question though? From being in the UK, does that happen on your Sky News and et cetera, et cetera? Like, is that same kind of denier getting on as a pundit? Because it doesn't happen much here in Canada.
We do occasionally, from time to time, have people who are. I wouldn't say they're as skeptical as the skeptics that kind of US mainstream media has, right. But I mean, it's it's certainly not as bad, but and we do cover climate change. Certainly, the BBC, God bless them, they do cover it from time to time, and it is mentioned seriously when we have these flooding events and so on. But it's still not covered nowhere near enough. I mean, science in general isn't covered nowhere near enough in journalistic terms. But yeah, it's slightly better than America, but it's still not great.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, I mean, there's also a big problem in the global warming movement, I guess, with messaging, right? And like they've done that like tipping point thing like at least 6 times that I can remember, where we have to pass something before this tipping point is reached, and they keep moving it after, because once you set an arbitrary tipping point, you're gonna have to keep moving it if nothing gets done, and that makes critics point to that, and that's not a good thing. So they shouldn't do like arbitrary tipping points. They should just say, look, this is the number of carbon we need to get out of the atmosphere. Like, don't give it a year or a date or anything weird like that, because it makes you sound dumb. So I would fix that part of the messaging. And also, people forget there is some good news. The United States actually cut its carbon footprint more than any other country in the world last year, and that's because of evil natural gas.
It's also because you got a huge footprint.
Right. That's what's not mentioned when they say that. Like, oh, look at how much carbon we cut out. Oh, by the way, we're still massively ahead of everybody else.
That's one of those stats that don't play out.
I'm just saying.
You gave yourself a medal for nothing.
The Chinese and the Indians are increasing their carbon footprint a lot, and we actually did cut our carbon footprint more than any other country. So
and you had an industrial revolution 100 years ago. So
yeah, but I'm just saying, like, so but when it comes to like climate change and global warming, I like that guy. I forgot what his name is because it's like Swedish or something. But he made a movie called Cool It, and I like that guy because he's smart. He invests his money in solutions that are economical and that do the most good. Like, he doesn't like believe in like a lot of like broad crazy solutions. So he likes to do step by step. He's called like the practical environmentalist, and like he's hated, but I think that's not a bad like place to start. Is like do practical things if you can't get big sweeping like legislation passed.
I'm also really tired though of having to hear people say, well, if they could just change the message on. No, the crazy deniers who are like out to lunch, like it's not on science to somehow like create a better mousetrap in terms of PR. I think that the denialism is so bad in America that it's frustrating for the rest of the world to hear like, well, they're not selling it correctly. I don't think there is a way to sell this that you're going to buy it. And that's a real problem.
But I mean, you're wrong. Like, you could say, oh, they shouldn't have to worry about messaging. I'm like, well, if you're losing, you should have to worry about messaging.
But you're not in other places of the world. That's my point. Is that like this is specifically like the complete denialism is an American phenomena that is not seen as many places. China and India have the hypocritical card that they can throw at the Western world, which is like, hey, we're developing, and you guys got to do this. So,
and conversely too, we also use that card. Well, if we don't use these fuels, if we don't use coal, then China and India are just going to use it anyway. So let's get it. Let's use all that we can so we can beat them. It's crazy.
Right. I get marketing is important, but I really think it's another excuse of like, oh, if they just sold it right. No, there's a ton of lobbying and there's a ton of just complete head in the stand stuff happening. I don't think you're just a poster away from making America go, oh, I get it.
No,
yeah, you guys should speak for themselves.
I'm just saying, don't shoot yourself in the foot by like making these weird deadlines or like whenever they do one of those weird stories to go off on a little tangent about how we're not going to have pasta in like 20 years or how we're not going to have coffee, like I laugh at those because those are ridiculous. We get really good at growing resources and food, and like to say that because of changes in the climate we're not going to be able to do that when you're not accounting for changes in technology, I think those are dumb arguments, right?
So you really shouldn't have to change the message from this shit unless we do something. This is going to end all civilization. Right. I mean, that's really kind of the end of the argument sort of thing. And if people aren't going to listen to that message, which is essentially the message of a lot of the scientists IPCC report is saying, in the next, okay, they've used, I know Sean's not happy with them saying in the next few decades, but saying in the next few decades, if you don't do anything, civilization will start to just spiral out of control and will die off. You don't need to change the message from there.
Yeah, no, Dan took the words out of my mouth. The reason why the other side has a better message is because their side is a message that they made up and they get to manipulate it. Our side is scientific data. So if that's not as sexy, I'm sorry. And the media is really bad at reporting science. That's why you get these stupid stories about scientists supposedly saying pasta's going to go away, because they're not saying that. That's some BuzzFeed clickbait nonsense that everybody else in the media is buying into now and making these outlandish statements. That's not on the scientist. But that's why our point isn't sexy, because we don't live in a world where science is sexy.